history of New York City, there was a serial killer that was feared by all the women of New York City because the serial killer usually targeted attractive young women with long brown hair. And during the time that he terrorized the city, hundreds of young women cut their hair short and dyed it blonde, and thousands more stayed home at night, afraid to go out. It was on a Christmas Eve in 1975 that two women were attacked by the serial killer. One of them was named Michelle Foreman, only 15 years old, and the other woman had no precise identifying information. They both suffered the same thing when Michelle Foreman was walking down a quiet street, when suddenly a dark figure came running out of a dark corner with a hunting knife in his hand and stabbed her frantically with the knife. Luckily for Michelle Foreman, she survived, but her injuries were very serious. However, it took a long time for the NYPD to find a clue as well as a suspect, because at that time, the security in New York City was not good, and all kinds of stabbings happened from time to time, so the NYPD didn't think the case was that serious, but after a year, the situation escalated. Wendy Savino was shot on April 9th, 1976. Savino was sitting in her car resting when a man walked by her car smiling. Then, as she was getting ready to fasten her seatbelt, the man walked by again. Savino originally thought he was lost and tried to come over to ask for directions, but suddenly a gunshot rang out and Savino was shot in the chest. Savino then tried to raise her arms to protect herself, but the man immediately fired a second shot, which went through Savino's arm and ricocheted off the car's dashboard, punching her directly through her right eye. A third shot hit her shoulder, penetrated her windpipe, and ultimately stopped at her spine. Due to the severity of her injuries, Savino pretended she was dead, but the shooting didn't stop there. Two more shots struck Savino in the back, and the man fled in a hurry after he thought Savino was dead. But Savino didn't die. Her desire to survive was so strong that she kept crawling forward, crawling through a parking lot, and eventually collapsed in front of a restaurant. Luckily, the restaurant staff found her and rushed to call the police and emergency services. The NYPD then questioned Savino about the man's appearance and drew a sketch of the suspect, but after a long investigation, they did not get any valid results. 3 months later, on July 29th, a new shooting took place. 18-year-old Donna Loria and 19-year-old Jody Valenti were sitting in Valenti's car, chatting happily. Then, Donna tried to get out of the car, but a fierce-looking man suddenly appeared in the shadows. He took a gun out of his pocket and shot Loria. Jody, who heard the gunshot, was terrified and tried to run for her life, but the man fired mercilessly. Loria died on the spot, while Jody, who was shot in the leg, survived. By the time the police arrived at the scene, the man had long since fled, but they still gathered a number of useful clues. Loria's father said he saw a man who had been sitting in a yellow car, and the testimony of other people in the neighborhood indicated that the yellow car had been seen driving around in the early hours of the morning. The police also identified that the killer used a .44 caliber bulldog revolver. Although Jody survived, she was unable to identify the killer in detail. She only described him as a white man, probably in his 30s, with short, curly black hair. Beyond that, the police did not find any motive for the shooting and could only determine that it was an indiscriminate attack. 3 months later, on the night of October 23rd, 20-year-old Carl Denaro met college student Rosemary Keenan at a bar. The two left the venue just after 2:30 a.m. Carl wanted to give Rosemary a ride home, but as they were chatting, a man put his face close to the car window. Just as they were getting confused, the man pulled a gun. The bullet shattered the window and hit Carl in the head. A shocked Rosemary immediately started the car and drove away. It wasn't until they reached a street with many passersby that they realized they had been shot at. Despite Carl having a gunshot wound to the head, which required a metal plate to be fitted to his skull, both survived. When the police found Carl, they identified the bullets as .44 caliber, but could not determine which gun they came from. Investigators also failed to connect this shooting to the previous one, as they occurred in two separate New York boroughs. Just 1 month later, on November 26, 1976, 16-year-old Donna DeMasi and 18-year-old Joanne Lomino were talking on the front porch of Joanne's house after watching a movie. The two girls saw a dark-haired man in a military uniform appear in the shadows. He began to ask them a question, but before he could finish, the man pulled out a gun and shot both victims. Despite being shot in the neck, Donna's injuries were not life-threatening. However, after that horrific accident, Joanne was shot in the back and paralyzed for life. The little information that the NYPD was able to determine about the case at the time was that the bullets came from an unknown .44 caliber firearm, and a sketch of the suspect was created and pieced together based on the girls' and neighborhood witnesses' statements. It's just after midnight on January 30th, 1977, and it's cold. John Deal and his girlfriend, Christine Freund, are sitting on a deserted street in Forest Hills, Queens, waiting for their car to warm up. They had just finished dinner, and John was looking forward to some partying. He leaned toward Christine, kissed her, and said, "We're going to the prom." She replied, "Okay, honey." John then tried to drive away and was starting the vehicle when a bullet shattered the window and hit Christine, who fell back against John without making a sound. John kept screaming Christine's name and then put his arm around her and put her in the seat. His hands were covered in Christine's blood. Then another shot was fired into the car and the bullet hit the dashboard. A scared John opened the car door, put his hands over his head, and ran while yelling, "My girlfriend is hurt." John didn't look back the entire time, and he didn't even know where the bullets were coming from. Even though the police arrived at the scene quickly, Christine Freund died 4 hours later due to unsuccessful attempts to save her life, as she was hit in the head by a bullet. It was this shooting that first led the NYPD to begin connecting the dots between several previous shootings. They observed that all the shootings involved a .44 caliber gun, and the killer seemed to be targeting young women with long, dark hair. On March 8, 1977, Virginia Voss Grishian, a student at Columbia University, was shot and killed on her way home from school. She lived just 1 block from another victim, Christine Freund. Virginia Voss Grishian was shot several times and eventually died from a gunshot wound to the head. Within minutes of the shooting, a neighbor who heard gunshots stepped outside and saw a short teenage boy darting away from the crime scene. Other neighbors also reported seeing the teen and a man matching the description at the scene of the shooting. The earliest media reports had implied that the teenager was the killer. Eventually, after an investigation, police determined that the teenager was a witness, not a suspect. Subsequently, the NYPD confirmed that this was a serial killing and held a press conference. In April 1977, in the Bronx, just a few blocks from the site of the first shooting, Alexandria Isso and Valentina Suriani were sitting in their car talking when they were both shot twice. Valentina was pronounced dead at the scene, and Alexandria died a few hours later in the hospital. Until her death, Alexandria was unable to describe the appearance of their attacker. But it was during this murder that the killer left a note at the crime scene for the first time, signed Son of Sam. In the letter, he described himself as a monster. "Papa Sam also locked me in the attic," he wrote. "I can't get out, but I look out the attic window and watch the world. I feel like an outsider. I'm on a different wavelength than everyone else. I'm set up to kill and to stop me. You'll have to kill me." Using the information in this first letter and the connections between the earlier shootings, police investigators began profiling the suspect. They described him as neurotic, possibly suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and believing he was possessed by the devil. In an attempt to track down the real culprit, the NYPD employed various methods. They tracked down every legal owner of a .44 caliber Bulldog revolver in New York City, interrogated those people, and conducted forensic tests. However, they were unable to determine which gun had been used in the murders. The NYPD even set up traps with undercover officers posing as couples in parked cars to lure the snake out of its hole, but these efforts proved fruitless. On May 30th, 1977, New York Daily News columnist Jimmy Breslin received a letter. On the reverse side of the envelope was written, "Blood and Family, Darkness and Death, Absolute Depravity, 44. In the letter, Son of Sam claimed to be a loyal reader of Breslin's columns and mentioned several past victims. He went on to ridicule the incompetence of the New York City Police Department, which had been unable to solve the case. You can't forget Donna Lauria, and you can't let people forget her. She was a very, very sweet girl, but Sam is a thirsty lad, and he won't let me stop killing until he's had enough blood, the letter read. Please inform all the police officers in charge of this case that I wish them luck. Tell them to keep digging, keep going, think positively, and cheer up. When I am arrested, I promise to buy new shoes for all the men on the case if I can raise the money, the letter continued. Son of Sam also asked, how much money will you have on July 29? Investigators took this as a warning, as July 29th would be the anniversary of the first shooting. One notable detail is that this letter appeared more sophisticated than the first, leading investigators to believe it may have been written by a copycat. The letter was eventually published in the New York Daily News, and Breslin also urged the killer to turn himself in to the police. The entire city of New York was thrown into a state of panic. Due to Son of Sam's predilection for attacking women with long brown hair, many women in New York at the time began changing their hairstyles. But Son of Sam didn't stop his killing, and on June 26, 1977, nearly a month after Son of Sam sent his first letter to the press, he resurfaced in Bayside, Queens, New York. He targeted Sal Lupo and Judy Pacito, who were again talking in a car. He fired 3 shots into the vehicle. Sal was shot in the arm, and Judy was hit in the head, shoulder, and neck. Despite their injuries, both victims survived, but the assailant was not seen. However, witnesses in the neighborhood reported seeing a tall, short, stocky man with dark hair fleeing the scene and a blond man with a mustache driving in the area. The NYPD believed that the dark-haired man was the suspect, while the blond man was considered a possible witness. Despite increased police patrols in areas where the killer had previously been active, by July 1977, Son of Sam had changed his location and was preparing for a final attack. A couple, Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante, were sitting in their car kissing when Son of Sam suddenly appeared and fired 4 shots into the car. Both were shot in the head. Robert lost an eye, and Stacy died from her injuries. Unlike most of the other female victims, Stacy did not have long or dark hair. There were several witnesses to the shooting who were able to give the police a description of the shooter. One witness said the man looked as if he was wearing a wig, which might explain the various accounts of blonde and dark-haired suspects. Some witnesses saw a man at the scene wearing a wig, driving a yellow car without headlights on, quickly fleeing the crime scene. The police decided to investigate all owners of yellow cars matching the description. Berkowitz's car was one of them, but investigators initially identified him only as a witness, not a suspect. On August 10, 1977, police searched Berkowitz's car. Inside, they found a rifle, a duffel bag full of ammunition, maps of the crime scene, and an unsent Son of Sam letter. The police decided to wait for Berkowitz to leave his apartment, hoping to have enough time to obtain a search warrant, since they had searched his car without one. When Berkowitz left his apartment, the police surrounded him, finding him holding a paper bag containing a bulldog revolver. When Berkowitz was arrested, the first thing he said to the police was, "Well, you got me. What took you so long?" When police searched Berkowitz's apartment, they found sinister graffiti painted on the walls, as well as diaries documenting his 1,400 acts of arson in the New York area. When Berkowitz was taken in for questioning, he quickly admitted to the shootings and said he would plead guilty. 3 medical professionals examined Berkowitz and found him criminally competent. In May 1978, Berkowitz pleaded guilty to all the shootings. He was ultimately sentenced to 365 years in prison to be served at the Attica Correctional Facility Supermax in New York. In February 1979, Berkowitz revealed at a press conference that his earlier claims of demonic possession were false. He later stated to a court-appointed psychiatrist that he felt the world had failed him and that he wanted to pay the world back in kind. Richard David Falco was born on June 1, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. His biological parents were Betty Falco and Joseph Kleinman. When Betty became pregnant, Kleinman threatened to abandon her if she kept the baby, as they were not married. As a result, when Richard was born, his birth parents gave him up for adoption. When he was about a week old, he was adopted by a couple named Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, who were Jewish American hardware store retailers. They changed his name from Richard David Falco to David Richard Berkowitz. From a young age, Berkowitz began to exhibit early signs of what would become a pattern of violent behavior. Despite having above average intelligence, he was hyperactive and irritable. He lost interest in school early on and became obsessed with petty theft, bullying, and arson. However, his misbehavior never led to legal trouble or negatively impacted his school record. On October 5th, 1967, Berkowitz's adoptive mother died of breast cancer. Afterward, his adoptive father remarried, creating a tense family situation, especially since Berkowitz did not get along with his new adoptive mother. His adoptive father and stepmother eventually grew weary of Berkowitz's emotional problems and moved to Florida. Left behind, Berkowitz's behavior deteriorated further. His grades fell, his religious beliefs wavered, and he became the target of bullying for being overweight, leading him to become increasingly antisocial. As he grew older, Berkowitz lamented his lack of a social life and his inability to find a girlfriend. "I believe that sex was the answer, a path to happiness," he once said. He felt that he had been unfairly deprived of what he saw as the key to happiness. Pathological thoughts about death and adoption also plague Berkowitz. Berkowitz originally thought that his adoptive parents were his biological parents, but his adoptive parents told him that his biological mother died in childbirth. And so Berkowitz grew up with a sense of responsibility and guilt for his biological mother's death. He also has disturbing and conflicting thoughts about his biological father, and Berkowitz specifically wonders why his father abandoned him after his mother's death. Berkowitz thinks that maybe his biological father gave him away to someone else because his father thought that he was the cause of his mother's death, and so he hated him. After experiencing great ups and downs in his life, Berkowitz became very withdrawn and lonely and wanted to find a sense of purpose and meaning in his life. So in 1971, he graduated from high school and enlisted in the military. After serving in the military in 1974, Berkowitz returned to New York City, where he dated a prostitute and developed a sexually transmitted disease, his first and last romantic relationship. Berkowitz then moved into a small apartment in Yonkers, New York, where he was alone and still dealing with emotions related to his adoption and the death of his adoptive mother. He became depressed, lonely, and above all, angry. Berkowitz then became obsessed with determining his roots. He wanted to find his birth parents. After an exhaustive search of public records, Berkowitz was thrilled to discover that his biological mother, Betty Falco, was still alive. However, when Berkowitz meets Betty, she acts distant as well as disinterested in Berkowitz, but she still reveals why she abandoned him back then. When Berkowitz hears these words, he breaks down to the point where he doesn't hear the news that his own father is dead. Eventually, he chose never to contact his biological mother, Betty, again because of his overwhelming disappointment. In 1974, he returned to New York and worked as a security guard, and it wasn't long before he became obsessed with Satan and the occult. By 1975, the isolation, fantasizing, and paranoid schizophrenia had progressed to the point where Berkowitz lost touch with reality. Feeling cut off from the world around him, he became an arsonist and set hundreds of fires in New York City without being arrested. As time passed and his disillusionment grew worse, he began to listen to the voices of demons who constantly compelled him to kill. In January 1976, Berkowitz moved into a two-family house in Yonkers, a suburb of New York. Berkowitz believed that the German shepherd that lived in the house and the other neighbors' dogs were possessed by demons who commanded him to kill beautiful young women. During this time, a dog in the neighborhood was shot and killed, possibly by Berkowitz, who also began to view his neighbors as demons. In April 1976, Berkowitz moved into an apartment in Yonkers, but his new neighbors also had dogs. His neighbor, retired Sam Carr, had a black Labrador retriever named Harvey. Berkowitz believed that the retriever was begging him to kill it, and he also believed that Sam Carr was a powerful demon, so in subsequent letters, he referred to himself as Sam's son, a reference to his neighbor, Sam Carr. It was after this that Berkowitz began his career as a serial killer. What follows is what happened after Berkowitz's arrest. In 1979, an inmate at the Attica Correctional Facility slit Berkowitz's throat, and he almost died in prison. In 1987, Berkowitz said he found God and became a Christian, calling himself a son of hope, and religion became part of his prison routine. In 1996, the police reopened Berkowitz's case to investigate some of his allegations, but the investigation was suspended due to the lack of significant findings, but remained open. In 2002, after Berkowitz had served 25 years of his sentence, he became eligible for parole, and parole hearings about him are held every 2 years. In fact, Berkowitz has applied for parole several times, but he has been denied. The most recent parole hearing is scheduled for May 14th, 2024, which is in May of this year. But his parole application continues to be denied, making this the 12th time his parole application has been denied. Interestingly, there was another law enacted for Berkowitz, the Son of Sam law. There was a media frenzy even before Berkowitz's arrest, with rumors of people willing to pay high prices for Berkowitz's stories, and some throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars at the killer's pen for exclusives. After his arrest, Berkowitz literally received tens of thousands of dollars from publishers for the rights to his stories. Then in New York State, there were senators who were outraged that murderers were getting rich from their crimes and introduced an amendment to the bill requiring that money obtained by criminals as a result of their crimes be paid to the Crime Victims Compensation Board for distribution to the victims of those crimes. The legislature acted swiftly, and the Son of Sam law emerged, which requires any entity, including book publishers, filmmakers, playwrights, etc., that contracts with a convicted criminal to describe his or her crime in detail to disgorge any profits made from that creation. As a matter of procedure, the state pays this money to the victims who file civil suits against the criminals. After New York, a number of states went on to enact their own versions of Son of Sam laws to prevent criminals from profiting from their wrongdoing. In a bill passed by the U.S. Congress in 1984, those convicted of federal crimes were also prohibited from profiting from their victims. Any convicted criminals who sold their stories forfeited their profits, which were to be deposited into a fund for victims. Berkowitz's psychological problems are an issue worth examining, and abandonment by his biological parents is a significant source of his psychological problems. Abandoned from birth, he grew up with a constant sense of insecurity and belonging, with serious doubts about his self-worth and a feeling of being unloved and unwanted. The death of his adoptive mother further exacerbated his inner loneliness. The loss of his adoptive mother, who may have been an important emotional pillar in his life, deprived Berkowitz of this dependence, while the family tensions brought about by his adoptive father's remarriage, and especially the uneasy relationship with his new adoptive mother, added to his stress. Growing up, Berkowitz exhibited a disinterest in learning as well as hyperactive and irritable behavior at school, which led to isolation from his peers and difficulties in establishing normal social relationships. Delinquent behaviors such as petty theft and bullying of his peers were outward manifestations of his internal dissatisfaction, but further deteriorated his relationships with others. As he grew older, he was deeply distressed by his lack of social life and his inability to get a girlfriend. Viewing sex as a path to happiness reflected his extreme desire for emotion and intimacy. However, the unfulfillment of this longing caused him to feel socially ostracized, creating a strong sense of injustice and frustration. Overall, Berkowitz's psyche was the result of a combination of childhood trauma, social frustration, identity confusion, and schizophrenia, which ultimately led to his serial killing behavior.